So, welcome to all of you. We're going to be looking at issues of health crisis in the Middle East. Microphone okay? Okay, good. So, just to start the introduction off, this is part of the Seeking Justice series that the Social Justice and Cultural Studies major has been running all year. If you would like to find out about other events that are coming, we have Tim Weiss, an anti-racism speaker, coming. We have lots of different events. On Instagram, it's SPU Cultural Studies. So if you'd like to find out more social justice events on campus, go to SPU Cultural Studies. Some of the upcoming events, we have a talk on racial microaggressions, and we're going to focus specifically on racial microaggressions at Christian colleges with and then the politics of fear in America. Tim Weiss is an internationally renowned speaker who's going to be coming. And then there's going to be a panel of American Muslim women who is going to come on campus. So I'm Professor Segall, and I teach Middle Eastern literature on campus. And one of the things that I do is telling our stories. I'm working with a mosque, and there's a Muslim women's empowerment group there. And they asked me to come in and say, there's so many stereotypes. How do we tell our stories in a way that makes a difference? So for instance, after 9/11, there was a research survey, and 63% of Americans said, we don't want a mosque in our state. I'm not talking about a mosque next to the house. I'm talking about in the state. And all those people had never met a Muslim or heard their stories. So this is the work that I do on campus, and so I'm really excited to have the next event, which is Health Crisis in the Middle East. Also, I lead a program, a study abroad program to Morocco. So if you're interested in getting a chance to meet Moroccan college students and to look at Arab Spring and the awakening that's been going on from the perspective of Muslim women writers, not just from political and historical perspectives, but from a really different vantage point, come with. So I have handouts if you're interested. And without further ado, then, I'd like to introduce Laurie Wilde, who is the host for today, the Dean of the Nursing Program.
Great. I can just hold it, I think. I'll do my sound check with the video. We're okay? First of all, thank you very much for inviting me to host and moderate this session. I'm very excited about it. I'm Dr. Laurie Wilde, and I do serve as the Dean for the School of Health Sciences and the Lydia Green Nursing Program. And I'm excited to see so many of you here today on a topic that obviously is close to us and close to the heart in the School of Health Sciences, looking at the health crisis in the Middle East. Often when I think very narrowly about global health, I think about sub-Saharan Africa or a very third world remote country where there is no health care. So in preparing and thinking about this session, it's a very different context, but yet health crises are there as well, and we need to think about those differently, and it will inform the kinds of work we do not only here but around the world. So I'm really glad that you've taken time today to join us. We have two very well qualified and excellent presenters with us today. I'm going to introduce them both now so we can just move seamlessly between them in their presentations. First up will be Dr. Mary Segall, who is there she goes, give her a round of applause. It must be one of her students. Yes, she is teaching with us, actually in the School of Health Sciences this quarter. We're very excited teaching the Global Health course. She has a Bachelor of Science in Nursing from a while ago and was one of the first Peace Corps volunteers. I was interested to see that. She was assigned at that time to a large hospital in Tanganyika. Did I say that right? Tanganyika, close enough, and got a wake-up call when the babies and young children died in the pediatrics ward due to the lack of a system for public health in that country. Almost all of us have some motivating factor to help us move on to the next area of study, and that was hers. From there, she went to receive a master's degree in public health and international relationships, and then to a doctorate in nursing. She taught for 25 years at the undergraduate and graduate programs in community health nursing and has worked for 30 years. It says then worked for 30 years, and I don't think you're old enough to have that sequential, so there must have been some overlap. Worked for 30 years in international development in over 20 countries. She has quite a CV that would take an hour to read. She has 2 sons, a lovely daughter-in-law, and 2 beautiful granddaughters who are committed to trying to make the world a better place for all. So it's kind of a family affair, so it's good. Our second presenter is Dr. Alice Rothchild. She is a physician, author, and filmmaker who has focused her interest in human rights and social justice on the Israel-Palestine conflict since 1997. So she has been involved in this work for a very long time. She practiced OBGYN for over 40 years. Until her retirement, she served as an assistant professor of obstetrics and gynecology at the Harvard Medical School. She writes and lectures widely. She's the author of Broken Promises, Broken Dreams, Stories of Jewish and Palestinian Trauma and Resilience. Also, On the Brink, Israel and Palestine on the Eve of the 2014 Gaza invasion, and Condition Critical, Life and Death in Israel and Palestine. She directed a documentary film, Voices Across the Divide, and is active in Jewish Voice for Peace Health Advisory Council. She is currently working on middle grade children's book and a young adult graphic novel. So she is a true Renaissance woman. So we're really pleased to have her, and I know she's brought a few copies of her book, Condition Critical. So without further ado, I'm going to invite Mary to the podium. Thank you.
It's wonderful to be here. I am delighted. And it's always a pleasure to work with Alice. Pleasure. It's great to be here. I could have talked a long time about many of these topics in the Middle East, but I wanted to give a framework for the role of the United States in global development and how it's changing. And the students who are in the Global Development Issues class, I've asked you an assignment to think about that role and how you feel that it's changed and how you feel about it. So, and then Alice will very nicely, she could have covered the whole Middle East, but she's going to focus on Gaza. So, you know, it's a lot of time. So what I have a handout because it was awfully dense. So I've given you the dense version as a handout, and it's slightly shorter on the PowerPoint. But just sort of an overview for these few minutes is to challenge our present strategy of combining development while engaging simultaneously in subduing an internal conflict in the country and then simultaneously trying to do some development. How does that work? And then we discuss, point out some of the challenges and risks to both the development workers and the local populations as this conflict is going on, and examine the role of grassroots organizations to respond to the local needs and mobilizing international resources, and describe the shift in support and funding for areas of diplomacy, defense, and development. How are our tax dollars and our support changing over time? The stories will probably wait till later. Okay, so the framework that I frequently use is around looking at the 3 Ds. And those are looking at, as we look at our role in global health and global development. So you've got the role of defense, first of all, the role of diplomacy, the role of development, and the role of defense. And these are 3 major thrusts, pillars, ways in which we approach and are involved with our foreign policy. So how is that actually operationalized? So if you decide you want to be a diplomat, where do you work? I mean, you could become a state Department of State fellow. It's a great career. But where do you work? You work in an embassy doing initially visas, helping people get visas or not get visas, but you know, those long lines. And then you might move up to be a political officer, a communications officer, and then you might end up running the embassy. It's an exciting career. Then also we have the Department of Defense in terms of our defense, and we send out soldiers in the military to do something in the name of conflict or helping or misguided things. Sometimes the diplomats and their great knowledge is not always heard by the people over in the Department of Defense, which is unfortunate because they have lots of ideas in the Department of State, but there's a gap. there. Now, if you wanted to get into development work, what is that? That is within the Department of State, you have a separate entity. It's fairly separate, and that's the United States Agency for International Development. And people, I know when I was your age, I didn't know anything about how to work overseas. I was just fortunate enough to get into the Peace Corps because it was formed in my senior year of college. But most of you, I know from my course in global development, have had some experience through mission trips and through working with NGOs or having your parents work for NGOs. So this is to sort of stretch your understanding that there are other ways of working in development than just the NGOs. And it's interesting to compare and contrast what does the Agency for International Development do and what do the NGOs do. And then, of course, we've got foundations. And it's amazing what the Gates Foundation has done. It's just, I can't say enough about in their work and what the amount of money and effort they've done has really changed the way the world, certainly in the areas of HIV and AIDS and TB. It's really been tremendous. So if we look at how much are we actually spending on this, so this, in the terms of through the State Department, through the Department of Defense, it's your tax dollars, if you're yet paying, but you will someday. It goes through Congress and then it gets allocated. So you look at the differences of the amount of money that is spent. So in defense, we had 18% of the federal budget, $700 billion was spent in 2018, and then it increased a little bit to $716 billion, 18% of the budget. So what is it, how much are we spending in terms of foreign assistance through the diplomacy, the dialogues that they have in terms of the ambassadors with other countries? It's less than 1% of the federal budget of foreign assistance, 41 million. Then in this year went down to $27 billion. How much is spent on development where you would say this is the actual interventions that are going to make a difference in people's health status? We are at 22 billion in 2016 and 17, and then 2018 was 15.4 billion. And it gets smaller as you read in the paper if you're following that in terms of how much it's getting cut. So that's the situation of our funding and the changes in the funding. So our priorities of the United States in terms of its foreign policy, that the defense since 2001 in terms of 9/11, the whole concern has changed in the way we operate. I was working in Jordan when 9/11 occurred. Every person in that office of mine came in, there were 50 people came in, and said how sorry they were that our country had been attacked. And they really, I mean, they could feel it because they're living over there and they're there. We had a great opportunity to respond differently, and we would have had the world's support for that. We missed it. We invaded Afghanistan and we invaded Iraq. There were no weapons of mass destruction in Iraq. That's been well documented. So that the defense has taken over in terms of what's happening. And the military, I know when I was sitting in Washington with the Iraq program, trying to do a rebuilding in 2004, the military was being asked to do development work. Now the military is trained to, fight and do those search and things in the middle of the night, shoot people. They are not trained to do. I would get phone calls from saying, "Ma'am, I'm supposed to do some teaching on health. Could you send me a book?" And they're not trained to do that. So what's happening to our development workers who are over there? They are asked, it's simultaneously in terms of what the development workers are trying to do development, and the defense is trying to still sort of stabilize the country. And it doesn't work well. It doesn't work well at all. So if we look at who is receiving the foreign aid from the United States, we have the top 10 recipients, with Israel receiving the $3.1 billion, and it's really has a very, I mean, it's not development, it's a defense. The defense programs are there. Now, back in 1979, you had the Camp David agreements, and there was an agreement that the aid for Israel and Egypt would be balanced. It's not even balanced anymore. You've got Egypt with less, but it is the second largest recipient of foreign aid. And it's really interesting that the way the foreign aid is administered in Israel is frequently in the form of checks. You know, you write a check for whatever. Typically, the way the USAID works when it's doing its development work is you have Congress allocates money to AID, and then you have an agreement between the country and the United States about a particular project, and it's based on their needs, and a project assessment is done, and they agree, yes, we want to fight AIDS in our country, or we want to have a program on family planning or childhood diseases to be addressed. So a contract is written, it's then competitively bid, and some company gets it, and then people are hired to go out and do it. So that's the way typically, and so there's a lot of agreements in oversight of the money. And it sort of, there's some goals and indicators of where it's supposed to, what to accomplish. With the money that's going to Israel, it's just frequently a bright check that goes to buy some defense equipment, quite a lot. Jordan has, you can look at the countries here. Jordan has $1 billion, and Afghanistan was less than $1 billion. Kenya, so you've got, you know, 3 or 4 countries, sort of Middle East, Asia, that we hear about quite a bit. So, where's Africa? You've got Kenya, Tanzania, I was always pleased to hear that, Uganda, Zambia, Nigeria. So you've got 5 countries in Africa, and then we're back to Iraq. No countries in South America, Latin America. Okay. So as I was saying that it has changed in terms of what it's like to work in development. One quick story is that when I was in Iraq, we had probably 50 people working on our project, and I was the team leader for improving the quality of clinical care. So I never left the compound except when I flew in to Baghdad and was met by a vehicle, several vehicles, and given a helmet and a flak jacket, got in the van with 2 other cars in front and back, and we quickly made our way to the compound. I never could leave the compound, even to walk out the walls for a cup of coffee, except when I went back to the airport. Never, one time we went over to the Ministry of Health to sign an MOU, but I never saw a clinic, I never got to the clinics. We had to have the people from the Ministry of Health come through those walls, through that security, every time they came, and we did our workshops, you know, in that compound, and worked with them. But it was, you know, it's like being here and doing this work without ever having any idea of what's going on outside you, and listening to them. And then you do training and like that. The people that I worked with did not tell their families. It was too dangerous to say, oh, I'm working for an American company. And almost every one of those people that I worked with, after 1 year, they could get a green card and come to the States. So they arranged a green card, walked in and told their families, guess what, we're all going to America next week. And they're all in California, by and large, or in Michigan. And so in terms of development, you know, what is the impact of this kind of work? The people that you're working with change and aren't there anymore. They're somewhere else. And it's also, it's an artificial environment. It's difficult. How much more time? Okay, I was going to say that in terms of the money, in the past, the United States government has had the major role of supporting development work. It's almost to the point of changing where Gates Foundation will be spending more on development than the United States government. It's almost there to that. And with the cuts in foreign assistance, it's coming up quicker. Just leading into what Alice will be talking about is that it's really a desperate situation right now with USAID in the funding cuts to the programs in the West Bank and in Gaza, that as of yesterday, all the NGOs were closed. And I think that did happen, that they closed down. They had to shut down the office there because there was a sort of an interpretation of the Anti-Terrorism Clarification Act. And so that if anybody was accused, or if some act of terrorism, or however you define terrorism, if something happened untoward with an organization that was receiving USAID funds, the government of Palestine was going to be responsible for those consequences, would be liable for that. So the government of Palestine, the Palestinian authorities said, they could not take that responsibility. Now, programs that have, usually when they're funded by AID, they're 5-year contracts. Well, I have a friend who is in the middle of her 5-year contract, Dr. Salwa Batar. She is leaving because the money is stopped. Even though they've got 2 years left of the contract, it's going to be finished. I mean, they have to go home. So the money, and this is money that's been obligated, it goes through Congress, it's allocated to a particular project in a company. The people have been hired, and it's stopped. And I don't know where that money, how they, get that money back. And we'll hear about that. So it's a desperate situation, and the NGOs internationally have stepped up to when they had those initial cuts, particularly through INRA, to all the refugee camps that were around there. They stepped up, and there were a lot of solicitations in responses. But if the money is going to be, because of this terrorism act, and if the government of Palestine, the Palestine Authority, is unwilling to accept that because of the possible implications, what's going to happen to the people who are there, who are living under such difficult situations? And with that, as a segue, go take it over to Alice.
Okay. So I'm going to focus on the healthcare crisis in Gaza. And let me give you a little background. I've been to Gaza 3 times, most recently in 2015 and 2017. In 2015, I went with a group from Washington Physicians for Social Responsibility, and then in 2017 with a group called Grassroots International. All 3 times I was invited by the Gaza Community Mental Health Program, and what we did was both direct services, documenting facts on the ground, interviewing clinicians, patients, and really trying to understand the situation as well as to provide some skills. So just to give you an incredibly brief history here, in 1949, Gaza came under Egyptian control after the Israel-Arab War, and so Egypt was in charge of all the healthcare system at that point. And that was true until 1967 when it came under Israeli occupation and military rule. At that point, Jewish settlers started being moved into Gaza, and then they were, quote, disengaged in 2005, and that was the start of a blockade of Gaza, a restriction by Israel of anything coming in or going out. The following year, there was a democratic election certified by Jimmy Carter, and Hamas won the majority in the Legislative Council. And then the following year after that, there was a civil war partly funded by the US government with a Fatah coup between Hamas and Fatah. Hamas won, and the international community responded by creating a very, very severe siege of the Strip. Also, there have been recurrent IDF, that's Israeli Defense Force incursions. There's been rocket fire from Gaza into Israel, and a growing humanitarian catastrophe. In addition to this, in the last 10 years, there have been 2 massive Israeli assaults, the last one occurring in 2014, as well as many lower-level incursions. The other thing to remember is that something like 70% of Gazans are refugees from the 1948 war. So it's a place where there is multi-generational trauma and generations of people who've lived as refugees. So I'm going to be talking about health in its broadest sense, health as a human right, health as access to water, housing, in its broadest sense. I also want to frame, I want you to frame what I say in terms of the Geneva Conventions. And basically what the Geneva Convention says is that the occupying power has to allow medical personnel to do their work without interfering. And when you see what's going on, I want you to think about, is that true? So The Lancet, which is a very important British medical journal, has a series on Palestinian health. And they describe healthcare, both in the West Bank and Gaza, as fragmented and incoherent. So we're talking about almost 5 million people. The healthcare system is run by the Ministry of Health, by the United Nations Relief and Works Agency, that's called UNRWA. And UNRWA is responsible for healthcare for the refugees. And there are eight refugee camps in Gaza with about 1.3 million Gazans. Then there are, as mentioned, the non-governmental organizations. There are also private providers. And all of this happens with impact from the Israeli government. And I have the word de-development there. That's very important when it comes to Gaza, because the Israeli government has a policy of de-development, that they will not allow institutions to grow. They will not allow material to come in to create bigger institutions. They will not allow clinicians to leave to get further training. It's a policy of de-development, which really cripples the region. So this was an amazing statement by someone writing in The Lancet, the medical journal, and he said in 2012, when you are living in hell and someone turns up the heat a little, it doesn't change much. You're still in hell. So what does that mean? So when I was there in 2015, it was right after the 2014 war, and what we saw was major challenges to the healthcare system, tightening of all restrictions. There was a huge amount of psychological and environmental trauma. There is well-documented medical complicity in Israeli prisons regarding torture of Palestinian prisoners. There was this policy of de-development, the repeated assaults that I mentioned, as well as factional discord between Fatah and Hamas, which really catches the civilians in between. So I want you to just think briefly about what is the impact of war. So let's look at the latest war in 2014. 74 Israelis were killed, over 2,000 Gazans were killed, including 500 children. There were some 12,000 injured, over 100,000 homeless, almost 500,000 left without water, 220 schools damaged, 370,000 children in need of direct psychological support. I mean, these numbers are breathtaking in terms of the trauma to the civilian population. And during that time, 20,000 tons of explosives were dropped on a strip of land 6 by 26 miles in size in 7 weeks. And the Gazans shot a maximum of 10 tons into Israel. Now, I just want to give you a little orientation here. So this is Israel here. And if you look at here, here's Egypt, here's Jordan, here's Syria, here's Lebanon, and this is Israel. So this is the West Bank, and this little sliver here is the Gaza Strip. So this is a blow-up of Gaza Strip. So we came in through the Erez checkpoint, and you'll hear me saying things like Beit Lahiya, Beit Hanun, Jabalia, Gaza City, Deir al-Bala, Khan Yunis, Rafah. This is the whole deal. That's what's there. So when we were in Beit Lahiya, this is an example of an apartment building that was shelled. We learned that 30% of the 100,000 homeless were living in the bombed out homes. And you can see all along here are these little shanties where people are living. And also, this was another photograph, just you have to wonder what happened to the person who needed that wheelchair. There was also a problem of unexploded ordnance from war, and there had just been a massive explosion in this area from unexploded ordnance. If we go a little further south to Beit Hanun, also largely destroyed in the war, and one of the things that you see, or that we saw, was just huge numbers of children playing in the rubble. So not only are they susceptible to injury, but they're also all the toxics of war that they're playing in. We also saw a huge amount of homelessness with these little shanties where people were trying to live. And this we saw a lot of. If you move a little south and east, you get to the city of Shijariya. This was a city that was leveled in the war. And I've been in a number of war zones right after wars. This was like breathtakingly horrific, just flattened. And this is an example of what the Israelis call the Dahiya Doctrine. This was developed during the Second Lebanon War, looking at the Beirut neighborhood of Dahiya. And the idea is that if you totally destroy something, that this will deter people. It's not an idea that actually works very well. If you move a little further south, you get to Gaza City. This is a major port, and it's a much more functional city. And these boats here, these are the fisher boats that are very restricted in terms of how far they can go out to fish, something in the 3-mile range, and they frequently get shot at, attacked by Israeli Navy, et cetera, et cetera. And as you can see, Gaza City looks much more functional. There are open streets, there are cars, there are standing houses. We saw evidence of fruits and vegetables and a much better diet for people. But Gaza City also suffers from severe restrictions on electricity. So people are living with 3 to 6 hours of electricity at erratic times during the day and night. And so we saw a lot of donkeys pulling fuel tanks that were running generators for people to have electricity. There was also a functioning middle class in Gaza City. This is a teacher who invited me to dinner, fabulous meal, tons of food, very interesting conversation. This is her son, who's an architecture student. There are a lot of Gazans who are going to university. And he is in love with the Olmsted's idea of the emerald necklace, of having green space within cities. And we had this amazing conversation of what it's like to be an architecture student in a place where you can't get any cement. And then at night, you see all these little red generators roaring away so that restaurants and people who can afford it can have electricity. Gaza City was also bombed, so there are also areas of Gaza City that look like this. And as you move south, this is the Mediterranean coast. It should be a beautiful tourist area. But this is called Wadi Gaza. This is a river of raw sewage pouring into the Mediterranean Sea. And it's happening because the treatment facilities were bombed in various wars, and because the Israelis don't allow supplies to come in to repair these facilities, and because there's not enough fuel to run the generators. But we also saw people fishing right next to the sewage that was pouring into the Mediterranean Sea. We saw kids playing in the water right next to the sewage in the Mediterranean Sea. So this is a massive public health hazard. As we went further south to Khan Yunis, this was also heavily leveled during the war. And we met with Nahed, who works with the Palestinian Medical Relief Society, which is an example of one of the big NGOs that's providing health care. And we visited a mobile clinic that was incredibly basic. I mean, you get 2 minutes with the doctor, you don't take your clothes off, there's a brief conversation, you get handed your pills, and then the next patient kind of thing. And as we traveled through Khan Yunis, we saw evidence of a huge amount of destruction and people living within the destruction. When we went east, and if you think about it, everything that's closer to Israel was more likely to be destroyed. Again, there was just a huge amount of destruction, and you have to think of what happened to the families living in these houses. And the houses were not close together, so they had to be individually targeted and bombed to smithereens. Now, in response to the housing crisis, foreign governments and NGOs have set up caravans. It's sort of a la Katrina. So we toured some caravan cities or towns, and this was what one of it looked like. There are rows and rows of caravans, very narrow streets, and people kind of packed together in this suboptimal situation. And we were invited into one of the caravans. This is, I think, donated from Australia. And you can see a little kitchen, probably feeding 10, 12 people. And then people kept saying, you've got to come to this one, this one, this one. So we went to the next caravan, and what we learned is that when they put in the sewer system, they didn't put in an adequate sewer system. So sewage is now bubbling up from the toilet and spilling through the caravan. The caravan has 3 rooms, and people eat on the floor and they sleep on the floor, and the sewage is bubbling up from the toilet. And we counted the number of people who sleep here. This was a family of 10. And these are 2 kids who live in this caravan. So the level of trauma to the civilian population is just enormous. Now, we met with this guy named Hamada, who's from the Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs. That's a UN office. And he talked about how the water infrastructure had been destroyed, how there are poor water filters, so there's a problem with the chloride-calcium balance, and now children are developing osteoporosis. He talked about how since cement can't come in, that people spend hours cracking up the old cement and baking, and then taking it to this facility where it's crushed into this really poor quality, that's made into poor quality cement, but it also creates all this dust, so there's this whole new problem with air pollution. He talked about how 2/3 of the UN schools are still being used for housing. I mean, these are classrooms where families are living. And then he said, it is really hard to be a humanitarian worker and having family and seeing this. That could be my reality. When will it be my turn? It is really hard. Now, we have to remember that of the 2 million Gazans, it's a very young population, 63%, under 25 years of age. It has a 40% unemployment rate, and it's much, much higher for recent college grads. And there's a huge college graduate population who cannot find work, 63%. And as I said, there are also enormous numbers of children who are playing in the rubble. There are also functional institutions. This was a school for kids with cerebral palsy. This was a school for the deaf, an amazing program there. So there are things that are working. So when I went back in 2017, what was different? The main difference was cement. So for the first time, we saw blocks of cement, which is totally changing people's lives. But again, the situation wasn't that different. There was the restrictive siege, food insecurity, land restrictions, buffer zones created by Israelis. Hamas and Fatah were fighting each other. There was still not enough electricity. And it was estimated that 95% of the water was undrinkable. And also there's further documentation of severe shortages of medicine and equipment, which is impacting on people's health. And we spoke with a human rights worker who talked about how the most vulnerable now have some basic services, food, water filters, some psychological interventions, but the people are really just hanging on. There's still thousands of homes that are flattened. There are 55,000 people waiting for their homes. And as he said, our problem is politics, but it presents as a humanitarian crisis. And just to give you an example, this is Segall, which was the place that looked like a catastrophic bombed out area. So all the big holes are now filled in, and this is the rebuilding. So rebuilding is happening, but it's happening at an incredibly slow rate. Now, as I said, we were invited by the Gaza Community Mental Health Program, which does an amazing amount of training and service. This is Dr. Yassa Abu Jamai, who's the executive director. And he told us in 2015, I feel crazy, but I come to work every day. We have 1.9 million crazy people here. And what we found is that every clinician that we spoke with at that point had to talk about the war and what happened during the war. So there was 51 days of fear, bombing, death, trying to mobilize the staff. There was a huge amount of trauma in the environment, politically, human catastrophes. And he said that in Gaza, there's no such thing as post-traumatic stress disorder. There's only continuous stress disorder. And what he sees in 2017 is if there's someone who was severely sick, psychologically, and they get a little better, then there's an incursion, a bomb, a loud noise, and they immediately relapse into their old stress disorder. He himself lost 28 family members, so an example of how the staff is as traumatized as the patients. And he said, I cannot offer patients something I cannot have for myself. This is Hussam El-Nunu, who's the administrative director, and he talked about the link between mental health and human rights, that this center uses what's called the biopsychosocial model, mental health in its broadest sense, and that the frustration, the hopelessness, all of this is a recipe for violence, violence against oneself. There are rising suicide rates against family, children, women, communal, tribal. He described Gaza as a time bomb. And he sees the work of the center is to diffuse the anger and then work to open the borders, open the economy. And he had a little son who a couple of years earlier had told his father, I want to be a martyr, which completely freaked his father out. So he probed further and further, and the little boy said, well, if I'm going to die anyway, I want to die for something. The center also has community centers. This is an example of a program in Deir al-Balah. This is Dr. Amal Bashar, who's the only female psychiatrist in Gaza. And she did an amazing art therapy project for kids with PTSD that's never P. And I just want you to look at the kind of pictures that these kids are drawing. Kids flying kites being bombed, lots of death, people lying on the ground. One kid wrote on his picture, so if you killed my child, you think you are strong? And this little boy's father was killed driving his vegetable truck. And for these kids, the Star of David is a symbol of death and destruction. So these are just kids' drawings. This is what they see in their lives. It really gives you a sense of the level of trauma. One kid wrote, I want to live in peace. And when we were back in 2017, I was struck by the fact that the child therapy area where all these toys are had all different kinds of weapons, because the kids have to work through all of their experiences with weapons, and that their art still was pretty disturbed and with a lot of destruction. Gazans are famous for their resilience, and the Gaza Mental Health Program has built a new building. It's now getting outfitted with the stuff that goes inside. So they have a big agency with evaluations, therapy, hotline, training. They work in the schools, they work on mediation programs, and they do human rights work. It's very impressive. Now, I was able to visit with a number of women's centers, so I'll just give you an example. This is a center that was in the north called the Aisha Association, and I just sat in on group therapy and sharing sessions. And what I was able to understand is that the women really needed to talk about war trauma, about their loss, about their family members that were died, about the increasing domestic violence, about suicide, about the rise in honor killings, about early marriage because people can't afford to have all their children, that this was the reality for these women. And then when I came back in 2017, the war was a little more distant, but they were still struggling with a lot of trauma. They talked a lot about the impact of humiliation on their men and on what happens when men lose their power and autonomy and are unable to care for their families. And by listening to these women, I was really able to see and understand the intersections between war, patriarchy, psychological illness, domestic violence, and the cultures that make this all possible. And what one woman said to me is, what Israel did in this war, they turned a child into a soldier, and women became unafraid of anything. Now, as I said, a lot of the infrastructure was bombed, and this is one of the bigger examples. On your left is the Al Wafa Hospital, Rehabilitation Hospital before the war, and on the right is after the war. Now, this was a 30-year-old modern facility. It was the most first world rehab facility in Gaza. It was repeatedly bombed by the Israeli Air Force despite multiple appeals. There were human shields in the hospital, and it all ended up with a catastrophic nighttime emergency evacuation. They're now sharing space in an elderly home. 20% of their staff has lost their own homes. And here is Dr. Basman, who's the director, showing me the holes from a drone attack on an ambulance, which is an international war crime. And we toured the hospital. This director, he knows all the patients, he knows their histories. It was a very warm, supportive place. And one of the most painful moments was when we met Hamad, who's 10 years old. He was hit in the neck with a missile. Most of his family's killed. He's a quadriplegic. And if he's lucky, he will spend his life at this hospital. And what Dr. Basman said, and Dr. Basman has lived in the US, he said, another part of the tragedy of the siege, killing the victim is part of the crime, but also forbidding the victim to say, we are victims and are human beings. This is a human feeling. Gaza is fine. What you see from the outside, it looks devastated. But if you live among the Gazans, you won't leave. I choose not to return to America. We are human. I am born here. You don't have a choice where you will be born, but I have a choice for whom I am. This was a report in 2016 from a UK breast cancer surgeon who went and did work in Gaza. She talked about the lack of critical meds. They don't have chemotherapy. Treatment gets interrupted in the middle because they don't have enough medication. The Israelis also don't allow any radioisotopes in, which really impairs both workups and treatment. And Gazan surgeons aren't allowed to go out of Gaza to go to conferences. So their training is frozen in whatever year they were trained in. And they were often trained in the Soviet republics. There was a study at Harvard Medical School that showed that the 5-year survival rates for Gazan women with breast cancer was as low as 30 to 40%, as opposed to 85% in a first world country. So people are paying with their lives. Now, this was a report in the Washington Report on Middle East Affairs at the end of last year by a doctor with Médecins Sans Frontières, and he said, I thought I had seen it all. I felt I knew the limits of what Gaza can endure, but the last 6 months have been more difficult, like another war. The human suffering and devastation have reached another height. And he was talking about the Great March of Return, which started last year, March 30th, and happens every Friday. There have been now more than 200 Gazans killed and over 23,000 injured. I mean, if Seattle faced 23,000 injuries, our system would be totally overwhelmed. And what happens is that large numbers of unarmed demonstrators are met with lethal force, live fire, explosive bullets. Hundreds of health workers have been injured, and 3 have been killed. And one of the most horrific things is that there's been a massive amount of trauma to the legs. And there's a lot of writing now about Israel's program to maim, to aim at young men's legs. And this has created a huge need for limb reconstruction that the medical system can't handle. And you also now see massive numbers of men on crutches and in wheelchairs. And this was from the Ministry of Health in Gaza. If you look at where injuries occur, half of them occurred in the lower limb. So we're not imagining this. This is a policy. Half of the injuries are by live bullet. So these are snipers aiming at the legs of young men. And the other thing that's happened is it's well documented violations against medical personnel. The field medical tents are repeatedly targeted and tear gassed. As I said, people have been injured and killed, as well as ambulances have been destroyed. So as we look forward to this wonderful year that we're facing, we have the same health crises that I've mentioned, only everything is a bit worse. There's lack of chemotherapy, radioisotopes, there are severe shortages in essential medications. There's a big problem where patients can't get permits, medical permits, to get treatment in Israel or in East Jerusalem. There are rising cancer rates because of the toxicity of the environment. There are the ongoing electricity shortages, fuel shortages, and you've got to think about the medical personnel. They are exhausted, and they also often are working without pay or with only partial pay, and they're working with an enormously and chronically traumatized population. The other things we see in Gaza are rising malnutrition, unemployment, poverty. Another medical issue is there's a rising antibiotic resistance, partly because there's not good labs to test things, and there's not good people washing their hands, basic stuff. The surgeons are also overwhelmed with injuries, and there's a lack of rehabilitation services. We see rising infant mortality and maternal mortality. Again, the civilians are paying with their lives. When you ask who is responsible, the World Health Organization has researched this and decided that the Israeli restrictions are the major obstacle to health access for Gazan patients. The RAND Corporation looked at Gaza and said the water pollution is a major cause of morbidity and mortality. And then we have the United States, which, as Mary has mentioned, has slashed funding. So UNRWA, which is taking care of healthcare for refugees, the US funding has been slashed. The US has stopped funding USAID, and then we have Hamas and Fatah continuing to fight with each other. Do you know who Banksy is? He's a political cartoonist. Well, there are 5, or when I was there were 5 Banksy things in Gaza. This was one of them. This was a wall in Gaza City, and he wrote, "If we wash our hands of the conflict between the powerful and the powerless, we side with the powerful, we don't remain neutral." Thank you.
We have a little time for those people to stay for some questions and answers, and those of you who have classes to go to. As a matter of fact, there's someone's alarm right here. So, in the interest of time, does anyone have a comment or a question? Oliver?
Yeah, I was wondering how, is there not books that they could get by, just bringing in books? Do the Israelis, they stop, could they, continue their education in another way?
So the question is, you're talking about doctors or surgeons, if they could continue their education with books. So it's often very hard to bring books into Erez, through Erez, and with the electricity being on, off, and it's not very easy to access the internet, to do internet courses. A lot of surgical training you don't learn from books. You learn from going to conferences and then working with surgeons. So it's a real tough issue. And also, if these docs are working 12, 15 hours a day with the acute crisis, they don't have time to try to figure out what books to get. It's just not a possible thing. So it's a really, really challenging area. I'll tell you one little example. I work with a group called We Are Not Numbers, and we mentor Gazan university students who want to write in English and be journalists and writers. So they send us their essays and we correct them and we go back and forth. So we actually get to know these 20-somethings in Gaza. And the woman who's the director of it is from the US, and she got a permit to enter Gaza, which is really hard to get. And then when she arrived in Israel with suitcases full of books for these students, she got stopped at Ben Gurion Airport and they wouldn't let her in, even though she had a permit to get into Gaza. So the security at Ben Gurion wouldn't let her in, even though the security at Gaza said she could. And then they, quote, lost all of the books she had brought. I mean, we see this a lot. So it's a very, very difficult situation.
When I was working in the West Bank, one of the people from our company, IntraHealth, said, why is it that the internet usage is 3 times greater from the West Bank than it is from all the rest of our projects around the world. And I said, they're in confinement. They can't leave their homes, their villages, because of all the walls and the permits and like that. So they are at home looking at the internet if they've got the electricity. So, the interest is there.
And even if you have the skills, if you don't have the equipment, if you don't have the antibiotics, if you don't have the suture material, if you don't have the morphine, it doesn't matter, you can't do it. And the problem with the limb reconstruction is that the kind of military that's being, I don't know what they're called, bullets or whatever they're using, is very destructive. It explodes, it causes massive damage. So you really need, very, very sophisticated limb reconstruction surgery. And that's just, a technological barrier for these people.
Other questions? Yes.
So you've talked about sort of the slashing of aid, things like that. You seem to be certainly recommending that you'd like people like both foundations and the U.S. government to be sending more in. But I'm interested maybe how you'd like to see that in your experience.
So the question is, with aid, what do we do? Okay. So first of all, I think it's very important to think about NGOs and foundations sending aid is not a substitute for a functional healthcare system. So I don't want you to have the impression that I think NGOs are the answer to the problem. The answer to the problem is a functional government and a functional healthcare system, and well-trained staff and well-funded institutions. In the absence of that, we have the impact of the groups like UNRWA and USAID. Now, I think if you look at, for instance, UNRWA, the UN group, this provides a critical amount of education and medical care for refugees. And I think it should be funded, bottom line. And the problem is, and since I do work with some groups that support, like the Gaza Community Mental Health the Gaza Community Mental Health Program, what happens is the U.S. government says, well, this group provides aid to a refugee. A refugee then goes to school, which is run by Hamas. Therefore, guilt by association, we won't fund this person because connection, Hamas. So it's like guilt by association without really thinking clearly what we're doing. And I think the other thing we have to think about is the demonization of Hamas. If you sort of go back and look at the last election and ask people what they were voting for, they were not voting for suicide bombing. They were, and these are polls that have been done over and over again. They were not voting to drive Israel into the sea. They were voting against the corruption of Fatah. And Hamas advertised itself as, we're going to have clean government, we're going to be good Muslims, we're going to take care of our people. And that's what people were voting for. And Hamas has done some absolutely horrific things in terms of the military wing. They also have schools and orphanages, and they do all sorts of social services that actually provide people with things that they need. What a lot of Palestinians have said to me is, if Hamas was allowed to be governing and they screwed up, we would have voted them out. We actually like democracy. And we didn't appreciate everybody, the international community, creating this horrific siege and making it impossible for Hamas to function. And also what it does is it makes people more desperate, more hopeless, more violent, more willing to use violence because they don't see any way out. So it's not really a really sensible way to approach this particular area of the world, as far as I can see. So, that's my short answer.
I would say the last page of the handout was like, what can we do? We can vote. We can be in touch with our legislators. I mean, it's, we are Democrat. We have to express, we have to get involved, we have to know what is happening and then do something about it.
Great.
Yeah, so in our last 1 minute, I want to say thank you very much. Thank you to both Alice and to Mary. Thank you for coming. Thank you for building your own knowledge and awareness about what's there, because it's only when you know that you can take action. So thank you very much, and thank you, Professor Segall, for coordinating this whole series. Appreciate it.